Right?
Yeah.
Welcome to the Tattered Cover. We're so glad you came out tonight to support the store, the independent bookstores. It's very important. And to welcome Alan Gilbert. But before we get to Alan, Debbie Main is going to introduce him, and she's more in the know than I am. So here we go.
We're so excited. A few of us are here today. We're students of Alan's over at DU. And this book for us goes back at least a few years. I remember in 2006, I was taking a class from Alan, and we just recalled a conversation a few weeks ago, and I said, yeah, I remember when you started that. And he said, boy, I already had 10 years in at that point. So this book for Alan is a labor of love, 16 years at that. And please come on up, Alan, and let's give Alan a warm welcome.
Thank you all for coming. I guess the first thing I want to say is that I started coming to Tattered Cover when I moved to Denver. I have known people who worked here well. I think of Tattered Cover as a place that stood up against subpoenas and snooping. That is to say, a place that defends freedom of speech and opposes censorship, and is really a fine bookstore, and I think it has a special meaning to everybody who's been around Denver. So I just wanted to say that it means a lot to be reading here. I'm talking about my book here, which is more what I normally do. I wanted to thank you all for coming. My dear friend Rich and my son Sage are actually taping this. And my old friend Doug Vaughn is here, who is an organizer of the Conference for No Attack on Iran, June 12th. And
May 12th.
May 12th, I'm sorry. Oh well, I'm postponing things merrily. It must be my avocation as a historian, not vocation. And I just wanted to thank, I can't thank everybody by name, Debbie especially, but my colleagues from DU, Arthur and Hyder, and Sheila and Jim and Amy and Craig from Metro, and all of you for being here. Okay. This is an interesting project because it breaks the story of the American Revolution, or it breaks open the mainstream account of the American Revolution. There is a not famous historian who teaches at Hope College who unearthed the diaries of Georg Daniel Flor, who was a German private who fought for Rochambeau on the American side with the French Royal Dupont. And he walked around the field at Yorktown looking at the corpses spread around after he'd fought there. And he said the majority of those dead on both sides were Mauren, Moors. And nobody taught me that. And I don't know about you, but I have yet to run across the person who knew this, and most mainstream historians who've even written on the Revolution don't know it. And you can't think about the American Revolution the same way if you know that fact. The Battle of Yorktown, the crucial troops who went out, and this was on the American side, were the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, recruited because whites served in the militias for 10 months and mostly wouldn't fight, white patriots. But blacks who were recruited in exchange for freedom in Rhode Island, along with Narragansett Indians, and were recruited into a regiment in Connecticut. And there are one quite shadowy regiment called the Bucks of Massachusetts. They all marched down to Yorktown. Baron von Clausen with the American forces said 25% of the American forces, the best dressed, which is ironic because mostly they were very poorly dressed, thank you. And they froze at the Battle of Fort Oswego and lost toes and limbs. Everybody froze, but the blacks were worse dressed. didn't have shoes, stuff like that. But they were fighting for freedom. He said they were the merriest, the most cheerful, the most disciplined, the best in maneuvers. Captain Stephen Only, the only family fought in the war. Stephen Only said, when Washington gave them the order to march out and play the part of brave soldiers, they marched out with bayonets fixed to surprise the British and take the 2 strategic British strongholds. And Only said that he thought His Majesty, speaking of Washington's knees shook, but that he wondered if they were not his own. And he empathized with the soldiers that with 15 minutes walk they must think the journey of life would end with them. And they all stood there listening. Washington's forces, the mainly white forces, 75% white. Shots rang out, and the black patriots won the day. They don't tell you that one either. They were led by John Lawrence, who was a great hero of this story, the son of a slaveholder from South Carolina, who studied Rousseau in Switzerland and really thought that slavery was inimical to having a republic. As Rousseau puts it, the words slavery and right, these words are mutually contradictory. And the truth is, the very truth, that the triumph after the Revolution of slaveholding in the South and the role in the Constitution of slaves counting as 3/5 of a man to elect Thomas Jefferson and Madison and all the others who wrote Slavery and Racism and the institution of the Senate that gives Max Baucus, who represents less people that are sitting in this room, more power than the city of New York or the state of California in America to this day, and frustrated Obama's program. So for the students here, if you're in student debt, if you are experiencing, it's not a severe debt slavery, guess what? The heritage of this is in the failure to achieve emancipation in the American Revolution, but there was a terrific fight on the American side for emancipation, and there was gradual emancipation throughout the North. And in some very large slaveholding states. New York had as many slaves at that time as South Carolina. So, how did I get into this project? I was looking at the American Revolution being an anti-racist, and I was writing on the Federalist Papers in the context of their being opposed to the Shays Rebellion, that is revolutionary farmers who fought for Washington and came back and were swindled by the banks. Right? And the Federalist Papers, which are misnamed, were designed to steal the money of these people and to get things away from the state legislatures. They would have a central government so that you couldn't have revolt that would pressure the state legislatures democratically to revoke the debts. So again, if you think of today's predicaments and the ways in which the banks pillage us, you may remember that the Shays Rebellion, which is denounced 11 times in the Federalist Papers, was a very good thing. And there was also the Alien and Sedition Acts, in which Jefferson was really good. So for a while, I was sort of fooled about Jefferson, because there are many ways in which he's very good. And he liked the Shays Rebellion. But the great slave revolt in Saint-Domingue that created Haiti in 1804, he didn't like. In fact, he feared it, because he was a slaveholder. And when he had a slave, James Hubbard, who escaped, Jefferson reports in his farm book he had him whipped as an example to the others. So I like Thomas Jefferson in certain ways, but I would just say that many of the founding fathers were slaveholders, and their power in America was great. And it is a long, deep, dark history of the racism that comes in American political institutions, in particular in the Senate, which has permitted the re-enslavement of blacks through convict labor, which has recently been discussed, as Arthur occasionally reminds me, in slavery under another name, which survived into segregation and which took the life of my elementary school classmate Andrew Goodman in Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1964, along with Michael Schwerner and James Chaney. So I was reading this stuff, and I thought, being an anti-racist, I should look into the issue of racism. And I figured it would be the colonial slave owners against the imperial slave traders. And there'd be a few black revolts, and I would find those sympathetic. And basically, it would be a tale of misery. That is, the American Revolution would be all right. But frankly, that many of the founders were slave owners. And by the way, between 1788 and 1860, when Lincoln was elected, for 52 out of those years, a slave owner was the president of the United States, and the only presidents of the United States who were elected to 2 terms were slave owners. And they were elected on the basis of, by the Civil War, 4 million blacks, 2.4 million votes enslaved. So, not the sort of thing that one is told in one's history book just right now. So this kind of breaks that story. But what happened was I read Gary Nash's fine book, Race and Revolution. And Nash is a great historian, and I praise Nash a lot in this book. I'm also critical of Nash in a way that I will say, but Nash actually responded very generously to my book, and you will see his statement on the back of the book. And it's a very nice statement, but actually it reflects in a certain way him and not me, in a way that I'll explain. So I was reading along in this book at about page 59. He says, a gigantic number of blacks escaped to the British and were freed in exchange for fighting. He said, we will never know this number, but historians have estimated 60,000 to 100,000, and recently the Australian loyalist Sandra Pybus has cast a severe eye on the statistics and has tried to chop the number down to 20,000. So one of the things I do in the book is show that many more free blacks went with the British. Historians standardly say 3,000 to 4,000. And the figure goes back to Benjamin Quarles, who's a great historian who wrote on this. And I show that it's about 9,000 to 11,000. So that's a pretty big discovery, and I do a slick statistical thing to show this. I looked at the lists of black settlements and compared this to the lists of people, the 3,000 people on the ships listed in the Book of Negroes, and it turned out that there was a much larger number who came aside from the Book of Negroes than came on the ships with the British in August of 1783. So she might like this because it shows that the British freed many more people than she said, but she might dislike this because I suggest that she downplayed the figures a bit. So I'll have to see how it comes out. But anyway, Nash said a gigantic number escaped, and we'll never know the number. And then he gave 5 reasons why gradual emancipation might have occurred during the Revolution, none of which is, I found, the main reason. The main reason is there was a dynamic of military competition between the Americans and the British, in which the British governor Dunmore freed blacks who would come to their side and indentured servants, and he started in 1772 threatening to raze the mansions of the rebellious slave owners to the ground. The whole South seceded given this threat. It's an exact parallel to the Civil War. They said the abuses of the Crown are the many abuses you know, including the 3-penny tax on tea. And by the way, they want to stir up, as the Declaration of Independence says, domestic insurrections against us. Even Jefferson, maybe obviously Jefferson, fell into this grotesque rhetoric. This